Hi, everyone, and welcome to Chinese EVs and More, where my co-host Lei Xing and I will go over the week's most important and interesting news coming out of the global EV, AV, and mobility sectors. What Lei and I discuss today is based on our opinions and should not be taken as investment advice. For those that are new to the show, welcome. And to those loyal listeners of ours, welcome back. We ask that you please help us get the word out about this podcast to other enthusiasts. And of course, tune in again next week. My name is Tu Li. I am the managing director at Sino Auto Insights, a global management consultancy that helps organizations bring innovative and tech-focused products and services to the transportation and mobility sectors. I write a free weekly newsletter that we pull many of our discussion topics from. You can sign up for it at sinoautoinsights.substack.com, which of course I encourage you all to do. Lei, good morning. In a cooler Massachusetts, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, good morning. This is your co-host, Lei Xing, former chief editor of China Auto Review, and this is episode number 175. We start off with the big fat 50, and I'm talking about the share of retail sales of passenger vehicles in July that were NEVs. 51.1%, I think, was the number according to CPCA.
50.78, I think.
Yeah, well, it's over 50%. So
Yes.
that's the milestone we're talking about. And it's fair to say that it's taken 15 years to get this point. Methodically, but obviously we've seen the take rate accelerate during the pandemic, but we've reached this point.
For those wanting to know in absolute terms, it was around 900,000 units. And 2024 is probably going to be around 26 million units. Lei, what do you think? 26, 27?
Roughly, yeah. I'd say roughly.
So we haven't hit that take rate until July. And so we would expect the annual take rate to probably be in the 40s, probably.
Yeah, so 40 is the ballpark number, for the year. And it's just point of no return, right?
But it's not just that EV adoption and more EVs are being purchased. The denominator is getting smaller from the standpoint of ICE vehicles are less popular. So it's not just a growing popularity, it's also that ICE sales are shrinking. So,
plus, very importantly, PHEVs are growing crazy because China counts PHEVs.
And everyone is joining the party. So BYD leads by a huge amount from a PHEV standpoint. I want to say around 40% of their sales is PHEV.
Or actually the other way, 60% would be PHEVs.
Sorry.
40% would be, I think it was notably higher in July as we talked last episode.
Yep.
I think in earlier month, it was roughly 50-50. But remember, BYD has launched a slew of these newer DMI models.
Yeah.
Chin L, for example, is one of those, the DMI. Basically taken over share from, I use the term ICEVs, traditionally internal combustion engine vehicles. So, yeah, so big help from PHEVs.
And another really important item of note is that, and we've said this, and I've said this in past newsletters, is that the Chinese EV makers, they live in the mass market segment. So the brutal competition is happening below 300,000 RMB or less than 45,000 US dollars. And it's being led by BYD because the Chin L, it can't be more than 250,000 RMB. So,
well, it starts off at under 100,000 RMB.
Yeah. So we're 100,000 RMB is around 15 grand for those folks. It's a glaring compare and contrast between the European and US markets that don't have that many choices below 30,000 euro or 35,000 US dollars. Whereas in China, there are numerous choices on both the PHEV side, the EREV side, and the BEV side or the BEV side. Because we should remind listeners that Leap Motor, one of their big technologies is EREV,
Yep.
and Li Auto is also EREV. Li Auto is less of a mass market brand because of the price point, but EREV, extended range electric vehicle. So it's from, I guess, Lay, we could call it a hybrid, but a different type of hybrid.
Yeah, the difference is the engines do not drive the wheels.
Yes.
Only replenish the battery. So that's a major difference. Whereas the regular PHEVs, both powertrains drive the wheels, right? So yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of debate on I've seen recently on the use of NEVs. I mean, that's the China specific term, which includes the PHEVs and the fuel cell EVs. But PHEVs, I think over recent times have really gotten a major boost. Two reasons. One, BYD, as I talked about, and then the other one, the EREVs. And some of the BEV companies looking into EREVs, going into EREVs as well, still.
And BYD is now in over 80 countries, looking at entering Canada. And so
Come on over.
they are leading the conversation with regards to the umbrella term that I coined, China EV Inc., that you and I use quite often, right? Like, so they're a formidable adversary for Tesla and the legacy OEMs. And so I don't see, well, one of the things that we're going to be talking about is the Chinese technology restrictions for the US market, that the Biden administration is looking at proposing restrictions or bans
Yeah.
on software and hardware that is supplied by, and this is where the fine print hasn't dried yet, so I'm not super clear.
So the way I understand it to mean is maybe the software part of it gets, some kind of restriction first, and then the hardware comes later. That's my understanding of it.
Okay.
So which I think in your newsletter you talked about, right? We also chatted about these LiDAR companies. Actually, Hesai getting those 3 foreign OEM customers in China
Yep.
only. And what happens, by the way, a lot of the Hesai has, I think, the number one share of LiDARs for autonomous vehicles, robotaxis, even some of the ones used here in the US, I believe. Let's say a Neural, let's say, any of these AV companies testing. That's a major red flag, right? And with Hesai being listed company in US, with them being on the
With an office in Michigan?
Yeah. So it's interesting, as also these AVs you talked about, what happens to their valuations, right? As they plan to IPO and with this news coming out.
And Hesai also supplies commercial vehicles with LiDAR.
Yeah.
Semis and things like that. So a brief history, because we've talked about this in the past, but for the new listeners that aren't as keyed in on the specific LiDAR industry, companies, specifically Hesai, Innofusion, can you think of any other companies, Lay? They've really driven the price down on LiDAR. And now you can put a couple of LiDAR on a passenger vehicle for probably less than $1,000.
Yeah. So the other one would be RoboSense, which recently put the new seal that was launched 2 days ago, I think, is the first, I think, BYD with LiDAR. And remember, BYD is an investor in RoboSense, and they're both based in Shenzhen.
So
yeah,
one thing that I want to always clarify, Lay, and I think we should start doing this from now on, because I think there are people out there that seem to be trying to take credit for things that we've talked about years ago, months ago. One of the things that I want to emphasize is that I had said last year that intelligent driving level 2+ systems will be standard within the next few years on many mass market vehicles. And so you're starting to see that with the BYDs. I just want to make sure that 6-8 months from now, someone doesn't come out and write it in their newsletter and all of a sudden people think that he's this brilliant person, right? So it's a slippery slope. And the United States government, the European government, the UK government, they all need to evaluate the risks associated with intelligent driving, connected vehicles. Now, I don't want to stop at Chinese. Do we automatically, because it's from Tesla, do we automatically accept it? And I'm talking about the US government, I'm talking about the EU, and I'm talking about the UK. I think they all should be evaluated. And
Yeah.
And if there are specific concerns about China, that needs to be clarified, communicated, and the policies and the restrictions need to be articulated, right? But it's not just because if they're hacked, it doesn't matter if it's a Chinese car. If a Tesla gets hacked, then there's risk. So you and I have kind of talked about this offline. The EU and the United States needs to get in front of this and just really, really communicate very, very detailed kind of thoughts on what they think about the entire space.
I mean, China. When we talk about China nowadays, it's the red flag, right? No pun intended. But anything, EVs, AVs, these connectivity data, it's difficult to erase that in this environment, especially with now less than 3 months ago for the election.
Yeah, my question, Lei, is that if we're so concerned about this, and I understand, let me emphasize this. I understand the difference, but if there's a risk about data collection, virtually every mobile phone in the world is manufactured in China. So this is where, and this is what's really important for me to understand. Are we going to be restricting Chinese branded tier one supplier hardware and software, or anything that's manufactured in China? So there's a difference, and I just want to understand that, because again, it's a slippery slope, because the Internet of Things, those devices, all manufactured in China. And I'm talking about Alexa, those little speakers that everybody has now. Those are all manufactured. It collects data. Okay, so that's what I mean by slippery slope. Where do we stop?
Yeah,
I'm not a politician. I don't have the right answer. I think it's great that they want to evaluate, understand, they want to study, and whatever is whatever. But the autonomous vehicle companies, the Chinese they've been in existence in Silicon Valley since forever, since the sector started. So
so that's the bifurcation that you've been talking about, right? It's increasing.
Yeah, exactly.
But I'm back to the sales part of it. I mean, we've been doing this pod for 3.5 years, and I think we've grown with the market, and nothing really surprises. Whatever happens, I mean, the 50%, the great fallout of the foreign automakers in China. I mean, it's as probably most of what you have predicted. It's
And I think what's important is that the 150 brands that Bloomberg says are currently in the China market, they can't last. 99% of them won't ever see a foreign market.
We kind of saw what happened to Hi-Fi and Human Horizons, right? I think that's done, pretty much done. The latest casualty.
One of the guys had tweeted a picture of the Hi-Fi CEO selling soy sauce on a live stream in front of a Hi-Fi X. So desperate times, man, desperate times. So what's clear is that we know that there are amazing products in China on the clean energy side. We likely won't see most of them in the United States, because the other important dimension, I'd written this in the newsletter, is this could be a way for the United States to close the loophole of manufacturing in Mexico.
Yeah.
So they didn't want to, or we as in the U.S., the U.S. government didn't want to have to reopen and renegotiate the USMCA, which is the revised version or updated version of NAFTA. And so this looks like a possible way for them to do that, because let's assume that every Chinese EV maker uses Chinese suppliers for all these control units, for all the software that they're using for level 2 plus intelligent driving. And the other thing that is not crystal clear to me, Lei, is it only intelligent driving software, or is it also connected? Two
Probably
different
both,
things.
because really anything that collects data, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
And so I'd mentioned that they should create a framework regarding, which cloud services can be used, and whether the big issue that they brought up is that US consumer data moves to China, is moved over to China. And so I don't see Chinese EV companies long term. I do, but short term it's going to be very difficult to find a second source, for a non-Chinese source, for a control unit in a intelligent, multiple control units on an intelligent driving system. And so I do know that there are a few car guys on the pod, so hopefully they're nodding their heads. Sourcing is just going to be really difficult when you exclude China from where you can source things from. It's going to be much more expensive, and it might be impossible for certain commodities.
and same goes for the China EV Inc. For eventually entering the US. What are they going to do? It's almost like Google versus Baidu, or Tencent versus whoever, right? In China for China, in US for the US.
One of the things that'll be interesting to look for and watch, Lei, is that you and I know the European automakers have a different situation in China than the US automakers. They still have a lot to lose. They've been losing quite significantly over the last few years, but they still are reliant heavily on the China market, not as much for GM and Ford and Stellantis. And so
Yeah.
there's got to be data hawks, national security hawks in the EU administration that want to also do something similar to what the United States seems like they're going to propose. So there's going to be this behind closed doors fighting about how far they want to go. The UK, they don't have any manufacturing to really protect, and so their first significant issue was the national security aspect of it. So keep an eye on those two, because if they adopt a very restrictive Chinese technology policy, that's going to freeze out China EV Inc. from two of the largest markets in the world. And they're going to have to figure out what to do with the excess capacity and where to send it.
Yeah, and it looks like China has already submitted a lawsuit to the WTO for the EU tariffs. I think there's the what is it called, the resolution mechanism, dispute resolution mechanism. Uh, what is China do to the U.S.? I don't know.
There's a bit of irony here, Lei, just because we have to remember one of the outcomes could be, and I'd mentioned this already last year, 2 years ago, is that a Chinese autonomous vehicle company is likely never going to be have significant presence in the United States, and vice versa. American autonomous vehicle companies, Waymo, Cruise, they don't test in China. They don't have any vehicles. GM went as far as investing in Momenta, a Chinese autonomous vehicle company. So they saw, or they suspected, that this bifurcation was going to happen. Okay. So it's kind of like the Chinese government's complaining about TikTok being restricted or banned, but we can't use Facebook, Twitter, and those things. Okay. And media tends to forget that. They need to also bring up the fact that there are no social media, Western social media allowed in China, but the fact that we allow TikTok, and I understand it, the United States, like open market, blah, blah, blah. I get that. But, there's a bit of irony there.
Yeah, and there's Chinese, let's say Chinese LiDARs on US autonomous vehicles, but there's also Chinese bodies on US autonomous vehicles soon, with Zeekr supplying the next
Yes.
generation for Waymo. But Waymo uses its own LiDAR, by the way. So that's an interesting tag team.
Well, they'd acquired a lidar startup, and it was like an acquihire kind of thing, like Apple does. So you're absolutely right.
So somehow China XX Inc. still finds way into the US.
Well, the other thing too, the interesting thing, there's what's that called? Oster? Is it Oster?
Ulster is, yeah.
And then Luminar. So there are American lidar companies. Velodyne blew up, but
Well, Velodyne kind of became Ulster. So
yes,
that's the history part of it. But
Oster is one of the really advocates for these restrictions.
yes.
So which and I didn't
And
do my
Ulster had
homework.
a lawsuit with Husai. I think Husai probably won, if I remember correctly. So,
Well,
yeah.
the one thing is we're, and then the other beneficiary is the Israeli company that you and I interviewed,
Innovitz.
Omar.
Yeah, Innovitz. Yeah.
So if we think about it from the other side, if there are some ambitious Western technology companies in Europe and the United States that need some investment, their valuation likely increased or will increase if and when this policy is published. So there's going to be pain in the short term, just because, again, from a sourcing standpoint, it's going to create a lot of headaches, and it's going to force a lot of companies to trace their supply chains up to the tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 level. And so it
Yeah, we'll just have to wait for the fine print.
yeah, so let's move on.
So we talked about sales. We talked about this restriction. What else?
Well, let me look at my
Well, he talked about Mexico. So MG is supposedly building up shop in Mexico.
yes. And it should be noted that Mexico MG is likely going to build ICE vehicles there, not
Yeah.
EV. Initially.
And somehow it's difficult to see MG selling in the US for some reason. I just don't relate.
Actually, I wanted your opinion. One of the other things that I think was very important last week that we didn't, and I don't believe we talked about it, was Audi looking at not using their logo on the next generation electric vehicles in China.
Yeah.
So you and I know the history of Audi in China, but can you tell the audience what the digital natives think of the Audi logo when they see it?
So the joke is, what do they do? Do they put one more ring, make it a 5 ring? But yeah, I mean, Audi, right, traditionally has been kind of the executive limousine for officials. But that's
for government
no longer
officials.
the case. That's no longer the case. But I mean, all ABBs, they're no longer resonating with, some of the newer generation consumers. And they faced, as we talked about, this competition from the Chinese EV Inc., the autos, iTos, the latest being the
Avatar.
Stellato, which ABBs might be smiling because they only got 2,500 orders in the first 24 hours. Like,
but that's an expensive car, so
it is. Well, it's starting at just under 400,000 RMB, so right at the heart of what ABB sells, right?
So hold on, let's back up. Can you tell them who Stellato is or what Stellato is?
Stellato is the third brand that Huawei has launched with in partnership with BAIC.
So Beijing Auto.
Beijing Auto. It's a luxury limousine. I'd say a 7 Series style.
It looks a little bit generic.
Yeah.
It's a C-Class sedan about the size of an S-Class or a 7 Series.
Yeah. And then now we have the fourth one, which is called the Maestro. Not the Maestro, but the Maestro or Maestro from JAC.
有点奇怪, man. It's a little strange.
Yeah. Supposedly another sedan selling with possibly prices into the 1 million renminbi, $150,000.
And a quick reminder to everyone, executive sedans normally it was popularized, the L part of an executive sedan was popularized in China because the people that buy them don't normally drive them. They normally sit in the back and they have a driver.
Yeah, and Audi is in fact the first one that did this with the A6L many, many years ago. I think in the early 2000s, they started doing this L and everybody followed, right? Mercedes, BMW.
Well, because of the government officials.
Yeah, exactly. But back to the Audi news about that logo of this newer generation based on the SIC electric platform. Neither SIC nor Audi have confirmed anything. So
that's a trial balloon. They just wanted to see what the reaction would be.
I don't see it as it could be a tweak of the logo, or they just slap the Audi letters without the logos. Who knows? But to me, it's insignificant because either way is a difficult hill to climb.
It's not just because of the logo.
No, part of the reason is, but
in you and I, it was kind of in your face because we lived in Beijing during the heyday of the A6, the A6L. So living in Beijing, about a mile away from Tiananmen and Zhongnanhai, you saw freaking A6s, black A6s everywhere. In 2008, 2009, 2010, when I moved, I saw A6s, and you could tell and you knew it was a government official vehicle or a military vehicle because the license plates are different.
Yeah.
So if it wasn't obvious enough that it was a government official, you just needed to look at the license plate. And because we lived in the equivalent of Washington, D.C., where all the government officials are, we just
basically
saw
the Cadillacs of China. Right?
Yeah, so we just saw so many A6s on the road in Beijing.
But now you have Hongqi, which is doing all right, I would say, taking a lot of share away from that too.
And a little bit of background on that is that I think in 2012 there was a new policy, revised policy that capped the price that you could pay for an official vehicle. It limited the size and displacement of the engine you could purchase, and I think the preferred vehicle list left Audi off of it. So it just became nationalized. But the background is that in 2008, in early 2000s through 2012, the kids that grew up around that time saw these Audis and associated this vehicle with being a government official car. These digital natives, these kids that grew up in the early 2000s, early 2010s, they are now Audi's target market. And they can't shake the thought of Audi being a government official car. So, generally speaking.
Yeah, so again, this is not a Audi problem. This is a foreign legacy problem. So imagine in 2 years when that Volkswagen SUV comes out with the Xpeng inside. Pretty soon, this Audi EV comes out with the SIC platform inside. You wonder the market reception, how that's going to be like. And given Volkswagen still sells. See, I'm being nice to Volkswagen again.
You are.
Still over roughly, let's say 2 million Volkswagen branded vehicles in China. That's pretty good volume. No longer as good as 4 million, 3 million a few years ago, but those are still consumers, right? That still looking for that brand, for that logo. Will Xpeng kind of retain that relationship? That's the thing that we're kind of looking at, right? If not, then I don't know what happens. Yeah.
If it's successful, it doesn't make sense for either party to stand pat. They should likely increase the intensity of that relationship somehow. Whether Xpeng contract manufactures for Volkswagen or acquires a larger stake. Stellantis owns about 20% of Leapmotor. And so We'll likely start to see that lines are going to start to blur, especially because of this bifurcation. And Chinese IP is going to be leaking into foreign automaker vehicles all over the world, in my opinion.
Yeah, and the SAIC Audi, I think they have the A7L and a couple other models, hasn't done well ever since, I mean, compared to the northern FAW Volkswagen
Yeah.
Audi, just haven't done really well in terms of market performance. It's really difficult for this new play to have any traction, given the current performance, it's not doing that well.
Speaking of ABB, you want to just talk about Merck and their level floor approval?
Yeah, so I mean, Merck, I mean, I think it's the first of all, it's the first foreign brand that has gotten this approval in Beijing, right? Both the urban and the expressway. And you would think, okay, the robotaxi companies, they get these permits is very normal. Every few weeks they get these newer permits. But I mean, Merck actually they've worked with Tsinghua University. They've done this, in the back for over a decade in China now. This localized testing of autonomous driving. So it's not that surprising that they got this. Are they going to put a robotaxi? I don't see that happening now, but
So they've
it's
slapped a hardware software stack onto a few S classes.
bucket,
And
yeah.
yeah, and they are testing them in and around Beijing.
E-Tron,
Yeah.
some
So,
familiar road that I've seen in their videos that they put out.
and
But
this makes sense to do it in Beijing because Merck is headquartered in Beijing regionally.
yeah, they have that new R&D
Yep.
center in Beijing as well. So I mean, it's just basically in China do what the Chinese does. BMW is right on the heels. I think the two of the ABBs,
Yeah.
Audi to a lesser extent, but
One thing that I would like to talk about and get your opinion on was what there was a newsletter or a post last week that talked about. I didn't read it. It alluded to the fact that the Chinese government wants to kick out the foreign legacy automakers from China, and I think that's a incorrect statement. I think it's absolutely wrong. Number one, the foreign automakers are doing a good job of kicking themselves out of the market.
yeah, exactly. I mean, Skoda, right? I posted some numbers on Skoda. 7,100 units sold
And
in the first half. I mean, these are
that
one of
that's
those.
6 months. That's not a
Yeah,
month
it's
number.
not
That's a
1 month.
6 month number.
And Skoda is among a few of the foreign brands that are really very close, or if not already, meeting their judgment day in China.
Oh
Chevrolet
man,
being the other one.
that's dead men
Uh,
walking. Skoda's
yeah,
dead men
Dead Man
walking.
Walking, exactly. But not, that doesn't apply to. I'm being nice to the foreign brands again.
Mhm.
Whoever is trying the hardest, they're trying to be relevant. These brands that have significant volumes in China.
Well, the reason I bring that up, Lay, is because I want to get your opinion. Because my thought is that the Chinese government actually wants some of the foreign brands to be pretty competitive in the China market because they want to be able to point to China being a friendly place for foreign brands for international competition. And so to go to zero on foreign legacy sales in China would not allow them to point to a competitive, friendly market to foreign companies. So I just, it just doesn't make sense on its face.
And the same goes for many of these Chinese brands, right? It's survival of the fittest, basically.
Yep.
Hi-Fi is gone. Who's next? Evergrande is probably done. Talked about that last episode.
There should be a few more that need to go away, but they're doing their best to be zombies. There could be a couple that take the export only route, like iWays, and so
Right? Some of these plants are being shut. Honda, for example, some of the lines are being shut, production lines. It's, I mean, as a company, you do what you have to do to, cut costs. But at the same time, last episode we talked about this AVs taking over drivers, right? This livelihood of people making a living.
That is going to be a decent sized challenge for the Chinese government. How fast they want to automate manufacturing, taxi services.
Hence, the recent incentives that included the 15,000 toward the purchase of an ICE vehicle, 2.0 liter and below,
Yep.
right? Not only the 20,000 for NEVs. That shows you, it's consumption. It's not the drive for NEVs. It's the drive for consumption, which helps, hopefully, to make these, the manufacturing keep running.
That is the key. And I think we're about a week or two away. Let's say beginning of September. We're a few weeks away from the mad dash to year end.
Yeah, so really we're at a kind of a lull in a, let's say the dog days of summer, but once the end of August, which begins with the Chengdu Motor Show, it's a new round of headlines, I would say.
Yes. And there are companies that will just react. And we talked about this last week for about 30 seconds, but
and then yeah, Xpeng just produced the first job of the Mona MO3. It's launching probably next week.
Onvo is going to start delivering
in September.
So folks, there are still new brands and new products being launched in the China market. If that wasn't enough.
Ridiculous.
And you're seeing really, at least in Western media, a little bit more the Chinese CEOs popping up on my feed. Lei Jun is very popular on Chinese or on Western social media. And but actually, I wanted to ask you because I didn't get a chance to click into it and read it. What's this thing about SU7 frunk flooding with water?
I haven't seen that. See, it's news to me.
Yeah, there's a headline that said that owners are afraid of their frunks getting flooded with water.
I'm hearing. So aside from it, I'm hearing a lot of issues with the recent OTAs that have been pushed out for wider use of their NOA ADAS. There's been some bugs. So I mean that's growing pains, right? It's their first model done only in 3 years. So,
and this is expected. Remember, if a new technology, if you get it into the hands of more and more people, more bugs, more problems, more challenges are going to occur just because there's just more in the wild and people doing things that maybe weren't anticipated. So it's not about the problem, it's how fast they react to it to fix
it. And can they take care of that frunk problem through an OTA, like what Tesla has done in a 1.68 million quote unquote recall?
Yeah, that to me that's I think everybody needs to kind of rethink the word recall because it elicits a different type of thought.
Yeah, the Tesla stands hate it.
I would too.
But there's really no what do you call it? A virtual recall?
Yeah, so like a service update or a bug update. I don't know, but that is. Let me see here. Is there anything else? Oh, the one thing that I think I saw was fairly interesting. Vietnamese. I'm Vietnamese ethnically, so very very curious about the culture, the country, what happens there. I was reading this article where VinFast owns 95% of the charging infrastructure in Vietnam. They just launched a small vehicle, a little bit bigger than the Wuling Hoguan Mini EV, does fairly well in the Vietnamese market. And there aren't a lot of third-party charging infrastructure yet. So BYD is entered Vietnam, I believe. And so they were interviewing Vietnamese consumers. And one of the things, and this is a challenge for the Chinese brands when they go to foreign markets, not this particular issue, but the types of challenges they might run into. In every Chinese passport, they have a map of the 9-dash line. Okay. And 9-dash line, for those that don't know, Southeast Asia, the Chinese government claims a lot of the South China Sea as their own, while the Philippines, Vietnam, they also claim part of the
Yeah.
South China Sea
Yeah.
as their own. And so a big dispute with that. And one of the comments was, if the GPS shows the 9 dash line on the BYD vehicles, I won't buy it. And so there was
That's the yeah. I mean
anecdotally, listen to
that's the
this though, Lay. Anecdotally, my friend who is married to a Chinese national, they had bought real estate in Vietnam. And because normally you could just send information digitally, but because she had a Chinese passport, they didn't recognize it because of the map of the it was quite, and so they had a lot more difficulty to purchase the apartment. And so these types of challenges are really, really deep rooted. Okay, I'm not saying the again, not the exact same challenges in other markets, but it's not going to be a cakewalk for all these Chinese EV companies, right? So
And that's the peculiarity of operating in any market. And in China specifically, the foreign automakers have had their share of mishaps. Let's say the Koreans with the SOD, the sometimes the foreign automakers, or not even the automakers, the foreign brands using the wrong maps, wrong, quote unquote, wrong maps of China that have backfired. This has happened in the auto industry, by the way, with some of the foreign brands.
it happened in
And
airline industry
yeah,
with the
yeah,
websites and things like that.
yeah,
So
exactly. So you have to be careful, but yeah, I mean that's the cultural and the local challenge that anybody faces when you enter a new market, right?
so
Aside from the geopolitical barrier.
so that's all I had, man. I let me see here if there's anything on the newsletter. No, that's all I had. We can open it up for questions if you want to raise your hand. I'll look at the comments here. A question for the end. Jeffrey, who recently moved to Guangzhou, any idea how many more micro EV producers are present and how many teeter on vaporizing due to the bigger players absorbing everything?
Micro EV.
I would think like Hoguan mini EV type of cars, I think.
So FAW Bestune just launched the Xiaoma, which is Little Pony, at 249 24,900 RMB starting price.
That's cheaper than some golf carts.
Yeah.
So
But
there's an island in Hong Kong, dude. I forget what it's called, but there's an island in Hong Kong that doesn't allow cars. So, and they only have limited license plates for golf carts. So, a golf cart on this island could cost 200,000 US dollars. So, anyways,
yeah, but in general, I think that micro EV that started out by William Hongguang, that's kind of faded as you make the upgrades and the bigger models selling cheaper. And there's some pandemic effect, right? I mean, for a lot of the younger female, that they wanted to have their own transportation during the pandemic, right? So Wuling Honghua Mini EV was the right for urban setting, was pretty, it's cheap.
and it still pumps up GM sales numbers too. So
Yeah, it's what you would call the mobility enabler, 代步车, right? So
and Jeffrey, I think what's important to remember is that if it gets saturated in China, there's always Latin America, there's always Southeast Asia, where those cars I think could do pretty well because the infrastructure is not as well built out, and so having a vehicle with 100 miles of range or 80 miles of range, it would still be but affordable, for 5, 6, 7,000 US dollars is still a win. It's an opportunity for Southeast Asia because if you look at Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, a lot of people still get around as a family vehicle on two wheels. So
yeah, so
uh,
Air EV, I think, is the number one selling EV in Indonesia,
yeah,
probably. Right.
so
So
still a lot of opportunity on that micro side, I think. I'm hoping that there are some cities in the United States that restrict city center, large vehicles from entering city center, and we'll start seeing micro EVs, in parts of Manhattan where you don't see an F-150 driving right next to it. Another comment he made, rush hour here in Guangzhou is so pleasant due to being all EVs, fresh air and relative silence, a sea of green plates. Oh, I don't know if Chris wrote this first it looks like Chris wrote this first. I checked the AQI in Guangzhou yesterday. It was 17, incredibly clean, cleaner than the beach towns of California. Well, that's because California has those freaking forest fires, unfortunately. But definitely, they say you are as stupid and outdated as your Audi. So it doesn't look like there are any questions. No one's raising their hand. So maybe we can end it on that note.
Sure.
Oh, man, I know we talked about video and I'm behind a little bit on learning how to do it, but let's try to do it
We'll get
next
there
week.
soon enough.
Yeah, let's get there next week. Middle of summer is just madness for me because of I'm basically a chauffeur. And so anyways,
Same.
Yeah, but I got it times two, dude.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyways, hey, everyone, have a good weekend. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We will talk with you all next week.
Likewise. Bye-bye.
That brings us to the end of this week's show. Lei and I thank you for tuning in. My name is Tu Lee, and you can find me on Twitter at Sino Auto Insight. That's SinoAutoInsight. You can find Lei on Twitter at LeiXing77. That's LEIXING77. If you wouldn't mind rating and or reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you grab your podcast from, we'd appreciate that as well. Even better, if you enjoy this show, please tell your friends about it. Please join us again next week as we track down all the latest news on China, EVs, and more.